Giri, with your permission, we will begin.
Yeah. Sure.
Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this edition of our webinar at the CFO Board. The topic and theme you are aware about. It's a continuing era of uncertainty and questions about what the future holds for us. I'm going to now request the chair of the session, Mr. Giridhar, to take over and lead the proceedings. Giri, over to you.
No, thank you, Pranjal, and thank you, my co-panelists, Stefano, Moritz. I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly, Moritz, Stefano, and Ritesh Tiwari, the CFO of Hindustan Unilever India. I think it is a topic which is kind of very in all discussions now. We are now seeing this being discussed in terms of the geopolitical risk. The sad part is that we have just recovered from the pandemic, or so we think. And we have struggled in terms of how we have navigated ourselves through the pandemic. And now, and that itself has resulted in a whole bunch of risks in terms of increased inflation, increased commodity prices in any case, demands come back post the pandemic. And now we have the Ukraine war kind of complicating the situation. I think it has implications both globally for countries and for companies, actually. I think so. It's quite a difficult area which is impacting the way we are looking at in terms of navigating our own businesses, actually. So I think hence, what are the key things that are impacting us globally is a topic which I will leave Stefano to talk through in his presentation, where he will give us the headline view in terms of the global risks that are facing us. And then we'll bring down the discussion to India, where there are a set of risks which definitely the country faces. And since this audience is largely Indian, and both Ritesh and I, one from the manufacturing and one from the services sector, I from the services sector, are also largely Indian. We will talk about the risks that we say we face as companies operating here, and the kind of responses that we are all seeking to do. So without much ado, I will pass it on with these opening comments to Stefano for his piece in terms of what he sees globally. Over to you, Stefano.
Thank you very much indeed, Giridhar. Really appreciate it. And thanks everyone for having me joining this very prominent and eminent forum. I'm a big fan of India, and I was there doing some work in 2018, and I just I hope that notwithstanding the volatility that we're facing, the world will reopen, that India will be and continue to be the driver of growth that it is, and that we'll be able to to do more work together. So and also just wanted to quickly wish a belated happy Holi festival for last week, which was amazing, and I had a chance to take part here in London. So anyway, I just when we started discussing this presentation, the idea was to go over the top 10 risks that Eurasia Group, our global partner with KPMG International, develops for every year, to try to understand what's ahead of us in terms of geopolitical risk and how it will impact business. And I was very excited, but then obviously, and that top risks is a worthwhile publication that I encourage everyone to look at. It's an attempt by Eurasia Group to look over the horizon beyond the media cycle and try to help companies understanding what are the macro trends to be looking at that might have the biggest impact on their business operations in 2022 and beyond. But obviously, the initial conversations happen in January, and I'll share my screen in the meantime. And apologies, my multitasking is not up to scratch, but I think you can see it now. Yeah, can you see it?
Yes.
Yeah, brilliant. So, initially the idea was to go over the top 10 risks, and that was in January. And then end of February, something quite dramatic happened in Russia that has a little bit thrown out, the broader list out the window, because of the severity and the seismic impact of this crisis that is having not only in Europe, but in the way that is redrawing geopolitics for the broader world, and the way in which the impact of the crisis, and particularly the Western response to the crisis, is having a direct impact on global trade, on global growth, and on key commodity supply chains. So look, I will spend, I know I have about 15 minutes, I'll spend more time on Russia, and then I will go and discuss a little bit what, in our view, from a KPMG perspective, are the three bottom line for businesses that are born out of Eurasia's analysis of the top 10 risks, and what we think are the key thematics that business leaders and C-suite leaders in particular should have front and center of their business strategy agenda for the future. So and we also did a publication, is the Bottom Line for Business report that you can access. And the idea and the aim, what we're trying to bring to you, to our broader community of clients and a broader network, is a little bit of an insight to go, as I said, beyond the immediate, beyond the crisis reaction mode, and enabling businesses and business strategists to look from a helicopter view of what are the key trends that are in motion, that are changing the world of business, that might allow them to plan ahead and reduce the negative impact of crisis eventuating, and being able to shift strategy quite rapidly. So in terms of the top risks, all of these will have repercussions for India business. And the few that I would like to highlight is the no zero COVID, number one risk for Eurasia. This is in relation to the big gap between countries in the management of the post-pandemic world. In particular, the difference between the West, that has decided to move on and adopt a living with the pandemic approach, vis-a-vis China, who's still pushing really hard on their no zero COVID. And what is this causing is that big lockdowns that are happening in China to respond and to stay true to the no zero COVID policy is obviously putting a lot of strain on supply chains. And we saw the impact that the lockdown in Shenzhen, which is China's second biggest port, that happened last week, is already having. So that's a really important one. Technopolar world, I will cover it a bit later. US midterms, just briefly, this is about instability in the US political system, and how the midterms election will actually be a signpost for what's going to happen in the actual election in 2024, and how most pundits, including our friends at Eurasia Group, see the Democrats losing Congress, potentially even the Senate, and what that will mean if there's a change in leadership in 2024 for the global order, and for the role of the United States in wanting to play a role globally as a global policeman, as the guarantor of the institutions and the rules that are basically at the core of the international liberal free trade system. China at home, again, it's a corollary to the no zero COVID. It's China being more focused domestically rather than venturing in big global campaigns this year. On the one hand, that's good in terms of stability, but on the other hand, that's there could be a downside risk in terms of global growth. And again, as I said, as China focuses more domestically, there's a gap in the way that certain policies are pursued that might create a downside risk for global trade. And then let me just go to Russia. Russia is probably the most significant element at the moment in geopolitics, for sure. And the Russian invasion of Ukraine is probably the most significant crisis that Europe has faced since the 1960s, the Spring of Prague, but some argue even since the end of the Second World War. And why is this? Obviously, I'm coming from a round of meetings in the UAE, and there's a lot of criticism around, the West is overreacting because it's a European war when other things flare up in other parts of the world. That doesn't happen. But the bottom line is basically the scale of the operations in course, the scale of the humanitarian crisis, and the size and the weight that Russia carry as a global player in this circumstance. So what we are seeing is basically European security architecture being restructured. We saw Germany taking a massive position in boosting defense spending, never done that since the end of the Second World War, pretty much. We've seen how NATO, after what many people would say were a few years of crisis and retrenchment, we saw a strong NATO coming together and responding very, very quickly with unprecedented sanctions that in a way, what they're doing, they are delinking what is the global 11th largest economy, Russia, from the global international system of financial and trade. And that in itself is something to be reckoned with, and something of seismic proportions. The other thing to note is that, this is not a sort of situation that will resolve quickly. The Rubicon has been crossed, and it will, regardless of what's happening on the ground and how the military operations will continue, and we're all hoping for a swift resolution and for a swift ceasefire so that, we can have relief from a humanitarian point of view. But politically, regardless of what's happening on the ground, there is a massive rift now that has been developed, and there is somewhat a beginning of a new Cold War. Unless there's a drastic change in Russian policy, the Europeans will struggle to maintain, good relations with Russia in the long term, and the sanctions are probably here to stay, and sanctions might be tightening as well. And from a global economy point of view, the repercussions of the war itself, the sanctions, and the reputational risks of doing business with Russia will have massive impact for a global economy. And we're already seeing the potential impacts on economic growth and inflation. And obviously, Russia being the third world largest oil exporter and the second gas exporter, not to mention all the other commodities, including food chain, key commodities like nickel, palladium, aluminium, and so on. But if you take all of this into account, we can see how these big crisis and the attempt from the West, led by the US and NATO allies, to put pressure through unprecedented sanctions, it's easy to see how this will have negative and potentially long-term repercussions on global economy, global trade growth, and inflation that was already on the rise. So, as we've seen, the key impact will, as I said, relate to oil prices skyrocketing above 100. I think it touched $150 a barrel on the Brent index in the few weeks after the invasion. Now prices are stabilized, and we don't know what the long-term outlook will be, but we know that we've never seen as much volatility in oil markets in the last 30 years at least. Same thing with commodity prices that are skyrocketing. I think an important one is obviously food directly. Both Ukraine and Russia are key wheat exporters, but also they are key exporters of fertilizers and input products for fertilizers. So there's a second round of impact on food chains if the cost of fertilizers increases rapidly, which is happening, and what that means in terms of production of food in other parts of the world, and broader food prices increase and inflation. Overall, our friends at Eurasia Group are working on a base case analysis of a 1% retraction of global growth in the year, and about a 10% contraction of Russian economy this year. So it's big. If you're talking about the 11th largest economy, 10% contraction in the economy, that will have massive repercussions. In terms of how the risks to commodity and energy flows are playing out, there are four things. As I said, number one, what's happening that is pushing up inflation, that is causing disruptions on supply chains, is self-sanctioning. Companies that are under a lot of scrutiny now to take political stances are beyond complying with Western sanctions. They're also deciding not to do business in Russia. And that is, as I said, from a purely economic perspective, what it's doing is reducing global trade, is reducing economic activity. Number two is the sanctions. Sanctions are growing. At the moment, the first round effect sanctions that we're seeing directed at banks, Russian banks, obviously. We saw the sanctions and the prohibition of using of SWIFT as an international system of payment, and export restrictions in terms of technology and other exports, and so on. But there is a risk that if the situation worsens and if the humanitarian crisis increases, well, then the US and the Europe might think about second round sanctions that will also have indirect effects on anyone who's will have to do business dealings with Russia. This is very important for India, obviously. And then the third one is obviously infrastructure loss. The actual war itself is causing a huge risk of infrastructure loss in terms of gas pipelines running through Ukraine. As I said before, food production in Ukraine, who's a key food exporter. And the last one is just curtailment and loss of supply, as all the other three play out. Supply chain shifts, and we might see overall loss of supply because of this loss of demand driven by the sanction, the self-sanctioning, and the infrastructure loss. So I'm conscious of time. We want to get into the discussion, but what a key takeaway is, we don't have a crystal ball. Nobody might see how the crisis will play out, when it will be resolved. I have a military background as well. I was trained in military, in infantry, and one of the saying that we have in infantry is military plans last only until the first contact, and then they go out of the window. So it's very hard to see how this is going to play out in the long term. But what I think many people can say safely, and basing this on conversation with our friends at Eurasia Group and their analysis, is that this is not a 1-2 month crisis, and the macro geopolitical implications of this crisis will have long-term repercussions for the world in years to come. And in a way, I think this crisis is only accelerating some macro trends that we had identified at the beginning of the year in our Bottom Line for Business report. And I go quickly through those. I'm conscious that I have like 2 minutes or 3 minutes. Number one is basically what we're seeing is a geopolitical recession. As business, we're used to economic recessions. They're very cyclical. Geopolitical recessions don't happen very often. And since the end of the Cold War, as global businesses, we were used to play in a system, in a global free trade system that was underpinned by international liberal order, multilateral rules, Bretton Woods, the WTO, and to some extent, we're getting used to be able to focus on what business does best, which is focus on research, investment, technology, and development of services and goods, and the ability to try to reach as many consumers as we could in as many markets as we could. And we just assume that the world around us would enable to do that because of the end of the Cold War and the flourishing of free trade and liberal multilateral institutions. Now, that order is under a lot of strain. And as I said, the Ukraine crisis is just an example of that. It's just one hotspot on a broader trend, which is mainly driven by the reducing overall strength of this global superpower, the US, and the rising of a new superpower, China, that does not necessarily agree with the same rules of the game that the US set for the global order. So as this competition plays out, what we're seeing is a fragmentation of the world as we know it. And we're seeing a retrenchment of free trade. This happened, even before the pandemic. We had the trade wars, we had the rise of populisms, the rise of protectionist policies, the crisis of the WTO that is still continuing, and so the world is somewhat becoming more fragmented. There's a trend in place. This strategic competition between superpowers, this fragmentation of the global order, is causing an unwinding of globalization as we knew it coming out of the 1991 at the end of the Cold War. Combined to this fragmentation, we have interventionism. Governments are more prone to use policy to act and tweak the markets and interact with the markets in a way that we hadn't seen in the last 30 years. And the way that this fragmentation, interventionism is in terms of industrial policy that we're seeing, taxation is becoming more front and center as government try to change, to align business with their national interest pressures. And obviously antitrust regulation is on the rise. And fourth is just overall regulation around labor standard and environmental standards. So the three watch points and topics that are really important for business leaders to look at are obviously trade and supply chain disruptions, a rocky energy transition. The crisis in Ukraine is only accelerating this big crisis that we're seeing. On the one hand, we had this ambition to move fast to decarbonization and COP26, net zero. But on the other hand, we have immediate rising energy prices. And so we have politicians in particular have the businesses indirectly have a big challenge in trying to navigate the short-term rising fossil fuel demand and rising energy prices with the longer-term net zero pathway. So this will be, again, an arena for fragmentation. You will see Europe, and we're seeing already trying to move in faster to a focus on renewable investment, withdrawing their reliance on gas and oil supplies from Russia in particular. And so this will expedite in Europe their move and their willingness to use policy to move to a faster energy transition. We have the Fit for 55 proposal. I'm not going to be surprised if it's going to become a Fit for 25. And this is obviously will cause differing standards for governments that want to deal with Europe, for businesses that want to deal with Europe and want to trade with Europe. We've seen, the acceleration of policies like a carbon border adjustment mechanism is a sign of this fragmentation. Europe is so, keen to move away from to really embark in this decarbonization strategy that now is being dictated also by national security needs. And to do so, they might have to move at a different speed than the rest of the world. And to do so, they might impose policies that will result in trade barriers, like a carbon border adjustment mechanism, which is basically a tariff on imports from countries that don't have the same level of carbon abatement ambitions. And finally is the technology and cyberspace world that will play a big role in the years to come. We're moving more and more towards digitalization, that we're creating this new digital world, but this digital world is governed by big tech companies that don't necessarily have the experience in governance. So even big government functions are moving into the digital world, business functions as well, but the rules of the game are not really there. It's a bit of an anarchic space. And obviously, the risk of cybersecurity threats is never been higher, and the crisis in Ukraine is increasing the risk, especially for business. As businesses take more decisive stances in the crisis, they might open themselves to being targets to cybersecurity. So cybersecurity has to be front and center of the business agenda. I'm over time already, so I'm not going to go over this. I'm going to open it up for the conversations, but very briefly, overall, there's an increased risk of public scrutiny on business. The room for business to be apolitical is shrinking because of different pressures, but also pressures internally from employees. and pressures upon consumers, and pressures dictated by the environmental, social, and governance agenda, ESG. So this obviously can create opportunities if a company is good and has a clear vision of how ESG plays in their overall strategy and maximizes the benefits of that, and tries to minimize the risk. But on the other hand, businesses will also have to make some choices that in a pure economic perspective might be detrimental for business, but that are necessary to stay true to their values and purpose that are driven by this increasing focus on ESG agenda. And so overall, what we're trying to do with the work that we do in KPMG International Geopolitics and our global alliance with the Eurasia Group is to help businesses really move from resilience to anti-fragility, to incorporate geopolitical risk in their key leadership discussions, not only having it at a sub-item in your risk management sheet, but bringing it really at the front and center to try to plan for these big macro trends that are shifting the way of doing business. Things are becoming more complicated, true, but that means that you just have to monitor things a little bit more closely, and you have to move away from just resilience building, is respond to a crisis and try not to suffer too much, to anti-fragility, which means something happened, how can you turn that risk into an opportunity? An example that I always make is what many businesses have been able to do during the pandemic, and that shift very quickly to a digital workspace, e-commerce technology being leveraged, and moving away from certain traditional systems into the digital world, and using technology to an advantage, and somehow probably boosting productivity, flexibility, and also work and life balance for businesses that have embraced this digital transformation. So on that, I'm gonna hand it back over to you, Giridhar. I'm really sorry I went over my time, but there's just so much going on, and I tried to cover as much as I could.
No, that's fine, Stefano. I think it was a very good overview in terms of the global risks that you pointed out. And before I go on to Ritesh, I just wanted to say a couple of words on India itself. We saw, as I said in the beginning, the impact of COVID itself in India. And as we have seen recent economic surveys and the budget document of the government, what was very clear, even before the Ukraine crisis, was that the financials of the country are beginning to get strained, actually. For instance, the gross debt to GDP has been about 55% or so at this point of time. That's number one. Number two is the fiscal deficits are clearly there. We're now beginning to see trade deficits. Normally, India has had strong trade surpluses, but now trade deficits have been significant because of the oil price increases. And current account deficits are also coming in because there have been capital outflows happening because of partly driven by the global situation, partly driven by, say, the US interest rate increases, is also resulting in negative flows of capital flows. And now when you see the recent changes in terms of the Ukraine war crisis, I think it's creating a whole new dynamic. I think one of the India on you talked about anti-globalization, and I think India also has been talking about what they call as Atmanirbhar, where based on self-reliance actually. And a lot of that confidence has also arisen because of the fact that India is a economy and a largely domestic economy. While there's a significant exports, I think it relies greater on the domestic economy in terms of driving growth actually. But if you see what I've been reading in the last 3 days, the Ukraine war affects fertilizer prices for the common man. Soya bean is not there. Sunflower is not there. Soya bean is not. And this morning I was gas and petroleum, but Russia is also an exporter of coal, which is affecting the steel industry in India. So I think some of the assumptions around self-reliance, some of the assumptions around what you can live with are certainly getting impacted. And for us, companies like us, which are largely domestic companies, I think the implications are not easy. With these words, I'll probably hand over to Ritesh as to what he's seeing as one of the largest FMCG, probably the largest FMCG company in the country, and how they are seeing the risks and what are they doing in terms of navigating.
Thanks, Giridhar and Stefano. Super thanks. That was a very thoughtful presentation and already a full report as well. A lot of important stuff which you captured. and along with your report. Because I see this, we all live and started to thrive in a VUCA world. Now suddenly that VUCA world seems to be new normal, and the intensity has now made us to live in a Barney world, a world which is more brittle, a world which is more anxious, a world now which is non-linear, and a world which is now incomprehensible. That's the trading environment now we all are dealing with. And I don't want to forget that as this is happening, as we're dealing with new uncertainties, there were two large trends, any which case were defining industry and business. One was digital transformation, and second was the entire ESG agenda. Now that has not changed amongst all the uncertainty and challenges, and it has become only more strategic and only more important to survive and thrive in tomorrow's business and today's world. So to me, those two are equally available, I would say, a port of call for us to lean into. The way I see the impact on FMCG, it is hurting. When I look at inflation, we have never seen inflation 50-60% impacting business. When you have at one side the crude cycle, and you have second on the other end the vegetable oil cycle, both of them impacting and inflating at 50-60%. These are 97th percentile inflation indexes that we are seeing. Now, when that happens, along with supply chain disruptions, which again we know what's happening with container freight and many of the materials in the world, and of course, last but not least, the uncertain trading environment with waves of COVID coming in, going out, and hence different consumer behavior. All this put together, we are seeing impact on consumption. Consumers are titrating volume, and hence that is getting impacted in the industry. So as I look at FMCG industry overall in India, we have seen that growth have come down over the last couple of quarters. We are seeing stress in rural economy this point in time, as the demand consumption has impacted in that space more than in urban areas. So some of those are clear fallouts which is happening. Now again, the job that we have to do as business, as CFO, as finance, that doesn't change. It just becomes more pronounced in terms of what we need to do. Where my mind this point in time goes is, what do I need to do to ensure that I am able to protect my business model? Ultimately, very clear agenda we have at Hindustan Unilever, for example, is to ensure that we keep growing our consumer franchise, even in times like this. So how do I keep getting competitive growth? Which would mean in times like this, two different kind of action. Now, yes, there is inflation. Yes, there is uncertainty. You will end up taking judicious and calibrated price increases. But as you keep doing that, the consumer value proposition cannot break. If that breaks, consumption gets hurt even more. And which is why, in my view, a big job to be done for many of us in the industry today is drive very hard cost down in the end-to-end value chain of the business. Now, there was a time one would look at supply chain very heavily on cost reduction, but that is not the only line one would go for this point in time. We then started talking about ROAS, all over advertising investment. Are we getting enough amount of ROI? But now every other cost, which all lines in the P&L needs to get looked at, be it trade promotions, be it organizations' cost of running the business, be it running the distribution and sales system, everything gets small and challenged in times like this. The more robust job we end up doing in terms of driving savings, the better job we can do in terms of maintaining and holding that consumer value proposition, which you don't want to dilute. The second impact and implication, in my view, is also a strategic and tactical understanding of resource allocation. We are in the difficult times, but what we can't do is to give up on strategic long-term thinking of the business. Those are the drivers which, in times to come, if not invested today, will get into compromising situation in times to come. So that how do we ensure that we're able to manage a volatile P&L in short and near term, but equally do resource allocation across time horizons. So the large bets, the large strategic intervention, which might bear fruit in next 2, 3, 5 years time, they are not getting compromised. Those speedboats are given enough amount of intervention and response and resources today. Those modes that we want to build around our business, we are able to focus on that. With this disruption happening everywhere, if I talk about FMCG, there's a channel disruption happening. Consumers are going more in terms of adopting digital commerce and then shopping in a very different place compared to where consumers of yesterday were shopping. Now, those trends are not going to change. So as a business, apart from protecting the business model, equally ensuring that the long-term strategic initiatives are funded becomes a key job to be done. The last thought I came back to you was the job that we have in terms of making a business case in finance, both for digital transformation and for driving ESG agenda hard. we know that in medium to long term, if at all we are not really good in that space, our business model will get compromised. So how do we ensure that we're making enough amount of progress on those two agenda? In my mind, finance plays a very large role in today's business, that we are able to make a business case for that investment today to ensure that we're able to secure tomorrow. Let me stop, Giridhar, with that, and we'll then open up for more larger thoughts.
No, that's a great input in terms of what you're doing at Hindustan Lever. Maybe I will give in a perspective from what I'm doing as a service industry, actually, before we kind of open it up to other questions. So essentially, I think the hospitality industry was one of the worst affected industries during the pandemic. And from in March 2020, we had the best results in 10 years. And in April 2020, we were staring at near zero revenues. You can't be more starker than that in terms of risk management, actually. And at that point of time, hospitality industry has always been an industry with high fixed costs. So one of the things we did say that the whole industry said it's a once in a lifetime opportunity to sort of relook at costs, actually. And just like Ritesh said, over the last couple of years, and even before that, we have been looking at costs very, very carefully, actually. And one of the, and in terms of maintaining profitability, one statement we did make to our investors sometime around 18 months ago was to say that how can we get to the same levels of EBITDAs? I'd say 80 to 85% of top line was what we set out to our investors, actually. And when we did it last quarter, I think it was to some extent a big proof of the pudding in terms of saying that this is cheap. I think COVID definitely, I think one of the things I would say, speaking for our industry, is that COVID definitely was a massive hit to the industry, and everything else is to that extent a bit pedestrian. Because I think for us, the whole thing is the better. I mean, I'm probably using a very strong word when I say pedestrian, but the point is, for us, we need our customers in our hotels, actually. If COVID took away our customers, and now our customers are back. And now the new set of challenges that we now see on inflation are another level of challenge for sure. But I do think that from a services industry, from a hospitality industry, it's not a case of our hotels turning zero revenue, actually. I think we just need to continue the work in terms of our cost reductions. And what we have done is that as we have come out of the pandemic, we are now focusing on a couple of very key areas. Number one is how do we kind of work on free cash flows? You know, to your point that we now need to not only manage the short term, but also manage the long term. And hence we are seeing from an investment perspective, yes, we will continue our investments for sure, but it has to come out of lesser borrowing, actually, because we don't want another problem to impact our P&L and our balance sheet. So that's number one. Number two is that we are making our bets on long term have changed, actually. For instance, what we have done is that on long term, we are largely following an asset-light model, which is helping us to conserve capital at this stage, which we believe is very important, actually. And of course, we are looking at partnerships which can help us do the investments, actually. Partnership as a way of investment is something that we're doing. As far as the crisis today that we are seeing in terms of energy, in terms of oil, in terms of inflation, I think there is some ability, because ours is a big function of demand supply. And as long as demand comes back to the levels that we want, our ability to play with prices is much better, actually. And hence, I think so far we have not seen prices impacting, our ability to leverage prices or tweak prices being impacted so far. But I do worry that as the economic conditions if it doesn't improve and it gets worsens, then there may be some impact in terms of ability to spend on large consumption events such as for instance, weddings and things like that. So I think you're absolutely right. As a corporation, we just need to make sure that we manage for the short term in terms of delivering to the market while building for the long term, actually. I think that's what we are doing at this point in time, actually. So going back to you, Stefano, actually, you ended your presentation in terms of talking about the 3 or 4 things that companies should be doing, actually. So what do you see? Can you give us some examples of what companies are doing?
Sorry, Giri, just one more thing. There's also a question by Mr. Jogendra Singh in the Q&A box about economics. So please do look at that. Thank you.
Right, we'll do that.
All right, I'll address your first question, Gurinder. I think your intervention and Ritesh's intervention are pretty much gold standard in terms of what we think businesses should be doing now. The bottom line is basically trying to look at geopolitics and broader political trends and the way they're impacting business, monitor them through, a risk framework, scenario planning, testing, even creative ideas on how things can play out, and then incorporate that scenario planning in your business strategy sessions at the C-level, so that, as you identified in your comments, you are focusing on the long term and you don't get caught up in just a short-term crisis reaction mode, and you focus on what are your key values, your key strategy objective, not just tomorrow, the day after, but in the longer term. And then you basically you keep monitoring those risks and trends, and you ensure that you have systems in place that allow your business strategy to shift and adapt quickly to the volatility and the uncertainty that we are experiencing. So, and in terms of how to do that, I think that I don't know, some questions that that the CFOs might ask themselves is, what are you going to do to make long-term perspective work in your organization? How are you getting to get people, customers, and communities that you're doing business with aligned with something that works long-term, more than 3 months or a year out, especially given all the uncertainty and the volatility. So, it's almost like the CFO, the CEO is becoming more of a steward, not only looking at financials anymore, but he's become more of a steward of a company in a more uncertain world. And that has to take into account broader political and societal trends and moves in the way that they operate, because we are seeing, to be entirely honest, a little bit of a withdrawal from a government to play that role. So at the end of the day, C-level executives are the people that have the ability to make a difference. And I think that this looking out for politicians to set a stable regulatory framework is something that is no longer happening. So stability is becoming a very rare commodity. And so I think that business leaders have to play a more prominent role in planning for the future. And I think your remarks exemplify this trend and this ability to do that. And I think the pandemic forced a lot of business leaders to just do that. There wasn't a choice. You either adapt or you're pretty much dead.
Yeah. Pranjal, you were pointing to a question, Pranjal.
Yeah, there's a Q&A, and the Q&A box is a question. Also, many of our board members are here, so I'll request them to also ask. Sugata has a comment to share.
Yes, hi, good afternoon, and very nice discussion. As has been rightly said, I mean, in time like this, you need to focus on the long term as well on the short term, and both are very, very critical, because your long term, the roadmap for, let us say, decarbonization, or the roadmap for building a more efficient delivery system, be it manufacturing or service or whatever, will not change. However, in the short time now, you have pressure of costs, you have pressure of availability, etc. And I think, as someone said, there's already strain on the financials of Indian companies, as you can see, and I suspect that this is going to get more pronounced. So calls will have to be taken on how you want to balance market share growth versus profitability in the short term, keeping an eye on the long term. So my thought is that, investors, we would expect them to be more mature in these times. And I think it's also up to us to educate them to an extent, how eyes remain, fixed on the long term, while there could be pressures in the short term in the financials. I think this is important so that we don't see too much volatility in the valuations of organizations as we, ride through this kind of period. Thanks.
No, I agree with you, Sugata, actually. Sorry, Pranjal, you were pointing to a question. Which is the one? Can you?
It's in the Q&A box. How the socio-economic and geopolitical risk play with sustainable integrity of business in terms of people, planet, and profit. It's in the Q&A box.
Yeah, I just see that question. How does it play with the sustainable integrity of people expressed in terms of people, planet, and profit? Okay. I think there was a response. I think so. Ritesh, would you like to take that?
Absolutely. Let me tee off on that.
Yeah.
Please join in. No, I think it's an extremely pertinent question, and we know that all the 3 Ps, marketing had known 4 Ps and 6 Ps, but these are 3 very important Ps today. All of us have to mention, and so whether your point was also very much bullseye to the same conversation. Let me pick up 2 elements and pick up from this and talk. Let me pick up people first. All of us focus at length on physical well-being. I know a number of companies which leaned in, be it vaccination, be it medical care for people at the peak of various COVID waves that we have seen. But now in my mind is a time where mental well-being becomes a prime important focus that all of us in our companies need to do. Last 2 years of pandemic, economical chaos in the country, plus many of the things we spoke about which are not going right, puts together a very different level of challenge to people. Longer period of working from home, not having so much of social interactions, starting jobs in a new company, working from home, not having that induction which one would need to have in the business. It's not an easy atmosphere. And hence, in my mind, taking care of people, a lot of focus was there on physical well-being, but now it moves to mental well-being. In my mind, pride, connect, and belongingness is a kind of intervention we will have to do. People have joined companies, they have moved jobs. All of us know the great resignation, which has happened in the last couple of years' time, which means many people have changed their jobs. They're in different seats. And starting a new job in a new company, working from home is not the best way to start a career in times like this today. So how do we still ensure that the connectedness that we had once had because of being physically proximate to each other and be able to travel and be with each other, how do we bring that back? Those are some softer elements. The belongingness, that you joined an organization, do you feel it belonged here? That's what will also not only motivate, also inspire people to do things. Do we understand the business model well? And do we have pride for the organization that we're working, or it is just a transactional relationship, a next contract we got into? And hence, in my mind, A, the mental well-being, and B, building the pride, connect, and belongingness in the employee organization will be very important agenda on the people front. Planet, I was reviewing earlier. Those are the conversations which, even before the recent Bani World intensity increase, that trend had already taken off in terms of businesses will have to be far more sustainable, far more responsible compared to earlier. There was a time you would think if this is business and this is sustainability, how can they come together? But now they don't need to come together. They need to be one. They need to be absolutely one and the same thing. And there again, in my mind, finance has a large role to define the business case of doing things. Last one, operation I will call out. This is also the time where business agility will have to get redefined at a very different level. We would run our business on basis of forecast, sales and operational planning process. With so much amount of trading environment changes, we can't do that. In today's time, agility does try and forecast. So that is one end of S&OP. And the second end of S&OP, we have all dealt with hard fixed cost. How much amount of my P&L now is variable is what really determines my agility of the business model. And to a large extent, can we further variabilize our cost models? To me, that also becomes a very important element of the third P, which is managing profit. Because we will have to dial up and dial down investments, dial up and dial down cost structures in the system, depending upon what training environment every quarter we are up against.
There are some board members. Abhay is there, Indu, Tanushree, Hemant, Rajiv. If any of you have a thought to share or a question, please do come in. If you can raise your hands, the team will just put you into the panel list. Giri, please continue.
Yeah, no, I think the point, Ritesh, you made in terms of building belongingness is a very important thing. I think one thing that I think organizations which are a legacy company are kind of working through to build that agility is also about reskilling employees. I think that is now becoming a very, very important part of reacting to the changes that are happening. Because if we need to kind of make sure that we have the ability to go, I think our ability to move people who have worked with us for 20 years and 25 years into taking on new roles and new responsibilities is becoming a very big challenge, actually. And I think the response, and I think we are really working through multiple programs where we can get our people to do different kinds of jobs and getting them to move. And what has helped us in that is what you exactly said in terms of belonging. We were a company in India which did not fire anybody actually. And since we didn't fire anybody during the pandemic, we have not had problems in recruiting, and therefore people trust us actually. So I think that's been one of the biggest ways in which we have been able to build our own resilience at this time in terms of dealing with crises such as this.
Giri, may I suggest, I think Rajiv, Tanushree, and even Hemant have a point, and maybe we can collect those and come back to you, Ritesh and Stefano. So Rajiv, short intervention from you, Tanushree, and then Hemant as well. In fact, Hemant is important because he represents DP World, so the logistics value chain we were referring to. I'm sure Hemant will have something to share. Rajiv, please go ahead.
Yeah, thanks, Pranjal. I hope I'm audible.
Yes, you are.
Yeah, thank you, Giri. So no, I think at the outset, thank you so much for such a engaging and comprehensive overview in terms of risk to all the panelists. My key concern and why I state this is essentially from a startup ecology, because having being engaged in the multiple spaces, I think they are among the most impacted for multiple reasons, especially around the resilient operations, because the key pieces is the supply chain difficulties which they are facing in multiple spaces, as also in a globally interconnected world. I think that has been consistently highlighted as one of the most crucial aspects for not just further scale growth, but the further capital to come in, because multiple pieces have got disrupted. And how you folks feel in terms of what could be the potential pieces to bridge in this space from avoiding the business interruption, because most of them can go down much faster, which will impact larger and maybe economies like India, which is starting to build up in a big way. So by any views, thoughts, perspectives on this?
Thanks, Rajiv. May I request Hemant also to come in, and Tanushree, if you have a thought.
My thought was very close to what Sugata mentioned on investor alignment, right? Trying to get investors to align on the valuation in the short term. I think I just want to elaborate a little more on that. We've seen COVID, we've seen Ukraine. Pranjal, you and I were having a conversation. I believe that the risks don't end here, right? The geopolitical risks, actually, there is China, Taiwan, and then there is India, POK, right? One never knows. So I think there are 2 or 3 elements to this. I think scenario analysis from a CFO's point of view has never been more critical and crucial than today. I think we can't live with just having one AOP. Every AOP needs to have a scenario analysis built in. I also think it's important for us on the same lines to actually have teams that can tell us what will destroy our businesses. Ritesh spoke about e-commerce. I've seen at Udaan how digital is disturbing the traditional supply chains, right? And I think it's high time that we start taking this seriously. Start employing people who will really look out in the world and say, this is a new business model that could kill you. So one is dealing with the new business models that are emerging, superimposing all the uncertainties that the world today is throwing at us. And I think from that perspective, people and talent becomes extremely, extremely important. And I think, Giri, you mentioned that you've not laid off anybody. You've maintained the staff, and I think that's sort of morale boosting and hand-holding people and ensuring that profits could be lower, but you're seen as an employer that provides that safe environment, not necessarily job security, but a safe environment, I think is going to define the businesses that will succeed over the businesses that will perish within these uncertain times. That was just my thought.
Thanks, Hemant, and then we'll come back to Giri and Ritesh and Stefano. Hemant? Hemant, can you hear us? So Giri, over to you. I think maybe you, Ritesh, and Stefano could respond
Yeah.
while Hemant comes in.
Yeah, no, I think one response which certainly I want to do is keep your business model simple in times of this crisis, actually. Yesterday, I was reading something that availability in the context of supply chain difficulties, availability is the new innovation, was what somebody said, actually, which means don't worry about launching a new SKU. Just worry about making sure your existing SKU has enough stocks, as an example, actually. I think was a very nice way of saying, keep it simple, guys, actually. I think when there are so many risks involved, and you're right, Tanushri, I think as CFOs, we have a role to play in terms of building out the scenarios and the probabilities around the scenarios. But I think as CFOs also, we have a role to play in keeping it simple. Because I think, and part of the problem of many corporations is that we try, for the sake of market share, do different things, or for the sake of profitability, do different things, which only complicate it. I think ruthlessly be simple is one thing I would sort of say, so that you can really address the big pieces today and then worry about, building on that base and doing other things, actually.
Sorry, can you hear me now?
Yes, Hemant, yeah.
Thanks. So thanks, Pranjal and Giri. Just taking off from where what you mentioned as an asset-light model. It's what struck me, is that it's a double-edged sword. So let's say in our business, containers are by and large owned by the shipping lines.
Yeah.
Correct. Now, in today's day and age, we know the problem with supply chains and consequently with the containers, the boxes that we want to use both for imports and exports. Given the fact that there are shortages, we didn't have containers hitherto, and we went ahead and tried to procure containers. The best part is, if we just take our country, there just ain't enough capacity. Ain't enough manufacturers, forget capacity. And the only other option is China, which is the closest one can get to, manufacture and send containers. A huge lead time, and plus the domestication process of the containers that come from there. So we have kind of, battling it on both sides, I guess. And that was just one thing that struck me, and I thought I must share this because we were looking at least 6 months before anything even starts hitting us.
True. I think the asset-light model, when we talk about, has to be applied depending upon the industry that you are in, to be honest, is what I would say. But at this point of time, when no containers are available, maybe owning containers is not a bad idea at all. Even if it takes 6 months for you to get it. Any closing comments from you? I think we are coming to the top of the hour. Any closing comments, Ritesh and Stefan?
I think one last thought, which probably just to respond to what Rajiv was also raising earlier and you alluded. To me, there are supply side actions we will end up taking as an organization, but there are equally demand side actions which we don't want to forget in times like this. And the right balance between the two is what will ensure long-term sustainability of our business model. So at FMCG, we know the overall consumption per capita is less than $50 in the country, and penetration levels are lows in many categories. And hence, the work on demand side action, be it as an organization, as an industry, also that matters as a country, as India, we need to kickstart the cycle. A lot of effort has gone into supply side intervention. To me, that's a larger thought I just wanted to give as part of my closing conversation.
Yeah, brilliant. And look, again, just want to strengthen, I think supply chains is a key theme, obviously probably the main key theme for global businesses in the wake of these volatile times that started, to be honest, since 2016 with the trade wars, and are just being exacerbated by the pandemic first, and now by this crisis, and then by, or as I said before, diverging COVID responses from different parts of the world that are putting strains on supply chains, and so. Our colleagues at KPMG operations and supply chain have put together a pretty good thought leadership piece on 5 key considerations to assist companies as they face more supply chain challenges, and very much in line with what was discussed. You know, they talk about how to build operations that are flexible and resilient so that you can shift, you know, supply chains or put your eggs in different baskets to limit your exposure to volatility. Use technology to maximize efficiency, and, you know, digital operations becoming more and more important. And then ensure that both your fleet management and supply chain networks are responsive and to increasing consumer requirements. And as we noted before, how, you know, consumers' trends and preferences change very rapidly, those networks should also be responsive accordingly. And then, you know, ensuring obviously that there's collaboration between supplier partnerships and also overall ongoing risk monitor needed. Going back to what Tanushree was saying, and, you know, overall, if one key takeout for me from this amazing discussion is that, you know, things are not getting easier out there, and there's so much at stake in terms of how the world is going to work, the rules of the game, alliances, the economy, and society at large is at play in all of this volatility. And I think this only highlights the value of geopolitical forecasting. And, you know, to repeat a quote that stuck with me in a seminar that I attended a few years ago, is that I think that planning business operations without geopolitical forecasting and scenario planning to the kind that Tanushree was discussing is like going on a picnic without checking the weather forecast. You know, you want to know if it's going to rain, how much is going to rain, if you need an umbrella, how big the umbrella is going to be. But it's also about the sun, right? Not only about the rain, it's about what are those glimmer hopes of sunshine that are on the horizon. How can you open up to the opportunities that will bring? So that's probably my final remark.
No, thank you for all your comments, Stefano and Ritesh. And I think this is an area where we can speak a lot, and there's enough to be spoken about. Maybe what we will do, working with Pranjal, is to kind of come up with some bite-sized discussion on specific matters which can help different companies. Actually, we'll do that. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Giri. Thanks, Ritesh and Stefano and all the participants.
Thank you.
I think we will go deeper into one of these subjects based on your feedback. Please feel free to write to us. I think Sakshi will share the email for all of you who don't have it. But the key issue is that the risk scenario is not abating, and we at the CFO board will continue to keep a sharp eye on that, and we hope to come back soon with a fresh set of discussions and debates very soon. Thank you again for joining us.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.